There is much to say about moral relativism and objectivism. So this is part one, where I focus on moral relativism, the terminology, and why someone would endorse a version of moral relativism. Before we get to the specific terminology, I just wanted to mention that when I teach this, I conduct surveys. Over a decade, the surveys come back with students saying that they are relativist. A vast majority, sometimes as high as 90% of students, answer questions that imply that they are moral relativist. Now, there is a small portion of those who also answer some other questions inconsistently that imply they're not moral relativists. So the part of that is because they're not familiar with the terminology and they haven't thought it through. Of course, that's the whole point. We want to think these things through clearly. So let's start with the terminology of relativism, broadly speaking. So it is the claim that all ethical truths or moral principles are relative to a culture or an individual. So we'll clarify that in a moment. And then we have this negative claim also, that there are no universal moral principles that apply to everyone. So we have the positive claim, the first part, and the negative claim, the second part. Conventionalism is a type of moral relativism. It's the most common version, at least as far as philosophers go, and it states that moral principles are all relative to a culture. So there is a convention within a culture that provides the basis for the moral claims. And of course, conventionalism also affirms the negative claim, there are no universal moral principles that apply to everyone. Subjectivism is the version of moral relativism that says that all ethical truths or moral principles are relative to an individual person. And then, of course, it also affirms the negative claim, there are no universal moral principles that apply to everyone. So those are the two definitions of relativism, the two main types, conventionalism or subjectivism, relative to a culture or an individual. And when we are talking about a form of relativism, there is an index that is required. So this is true for both forms of relativism. Since moral principles are not universal, there needs to be an index of some kind. So the implication here is that ethical claims or moral principles that are stated must have a cultural index or an individual index in order to be meaningful. It's as if somebody were returning from vacation and they said to you, oh, I had a wonderful time. The culture was so interesting. The scenery was beautiful. The food was fantastic. But you didn't know where they go. They had gone. So your first question is, but where are you talking about? You may want to visit there, but you need to know the index. What are they talking about? Where was their vacation? And when we say that moral principles are all relative to a culture or an individual, we have to know what culture or what individual. So this would apply to every single moral claim. So if someone said something like, lying for personal gain is morally wrong, that would have to have an index. Right? They would have to say, well, it's morally wrong in 21st century United States, maybe, but maybe not in 19th century Germany or some other culture. So we have to have indexes to help us clarify, since morality is relative, to what, right? The index tells us where or what it's relative to. Well, let's talk about subjectivism in particular here. Why would somebody endorse subjectivism? As we think about it carefully, well, each person has different tastes and beliefs about morality, so you can do surveys, you can ask questions about, do you think this is morally wrong? Do you think that is morally wrong? And you're going to get different answers from different people. So that seems to be a motive for subjectivism. And for many people, it seems right to say something like this: well, what's right for you may not be right for me. So this is certainly true about something that may or may not be a moral issue. For I have friends who are vegetarian, I am not, so they say, well, it's morally wrong for me to eat meat, but maybe it's okay for you to eat meat. It just depends on the individual. We'll put aside the morality of vegetarianism. There are interesting things to say about that, but not anymore in this video. So often people take these kinds of statements to mean that there is no moral standard beyond one's individual opinion, and that would be subjectivism, right? All moral claims are relative to an individual. But there are significant problems for subjectivism, very good reasons to think it is in fact false. One major reason is it conflicts with some of our basic moral intuitions. So when we hear about things like suicide bombers attacking a building or a barracks or something, or we hear about in the late 90s, one of the first mass shootings in a school in Columbine, Colorado, or a more recent one in 2019, an El Paso shooting. These perpetrators firmly believed what they were doing was morally good. So we have, for example, the diary, the writings of Klebel, and he thought that what he was doing was showing his moral superiority by going in and shooting innocent classmates. The person in El Paso thought he was doing something morally good by sending a warning to immigrants or something like that, if there was a rationale. So if subjectivism is true, though, then we would have to say that these people were doing something morally good. If morality is merely up to the individual, these people were behaving the way they believed they ought to behave, and so it was morally good. And we might say, well, I would never do that, or I think it would be wrong for me to do that. Well, that's you. That's your moral system, but it's not the moral system of these individuals. And so we have this issue here. Is it morally wrong to kill innocent people or not? If you say yes, then there's going to be a problem with subjectivism that conflicts with subjectivism. Another problem is that subjectivism implies that it's impossible to disagree about morality. But of course it is possible. I mean, it seems possible right on the face of it, but think about it. What about a case of, for example, somebody borrows money from you, they borrow $20 and they say, don't worry, I'll give it back on Friday when I get paid. And you say, okay, fine. And then you see them on Monday and you say, hey, do you have that $20? And the person says, oh no, I'm not going to give that back. My moral code says what I want to do is lie, cheat, and steal, do whatever I can in order to get money so that I can control it because I believe I'm the best person to handle money. And so too bad, you're not getting your money back. Now, if subjectivism is true, you can't really disagree with this person. You can say, but that's morally wrong, but all that would mean is that it's morally wrong for you to promise to pay somebody back and not do it. But it's not morally wrong for this other person, and all of morality depends on the individual. And so what that person did, the person who borrowed money and didn't repay it, was morally right according to subjectivism. But now there's no disagreement, right? You have your moral code, they have their moral code. You can't argue about this. There's no disagreement if subjectivism is true. But there is disagreement, right? Obviously there is. Okay, a third problem for subjectivism. It implies that everyone's moral judgments are always correct. Right? This seemed to follow from the second point we were making about disagreement. But let's this time think about that in terms of an individual person who changes their views, right? Our moral views, our moral judgments are not always correct. We sometimes change our beliefs about morality. So one of the individuals I know who thinks it's morally wrong to eat meat grew up eating meat, right? So once they believed it was morally okay, and now they believe it's not morally okay. Norma McCorvey, the woman who was Jane Roe in Roe versus Wade, at one point when she was bringing the case forward, thought that abortion was morally permissible. Later in her life, now she says that she was wrong about that. Anytime we change our moral beliefs, see, a slave owner in the 1800s becomes converted to Christianity and begins to believe that owning slaves is morally wrong, so he releases them, right? You can't say that you're morally wrong. No one can say they were wrong in their judgments in the past, because if morality fully depends on the individual's judgment, then that was morally right at that time. It may not be morally right for you now, but it was morally right for you then. But that's not the way we assess ourselves. That's not what we believe. So subjectivism is deeply inconsistent with the beliefs that we firmly hold, and so it ought to be rejected. Okay, let's consider conventionalism. Now, there's a traditional argument for conventionalism, and then it's modified somewhat into a more contemporary argument. So I'll take the traditional argument first, and I'm trying to lay this out as carefully and as charitably as I can. Now, first of all, it starts with the idea that there are significant differences in what is considered normal in differing cultures. Well, that certainly seems to be true, right? The way women are treated, or what people eat, or how much skin is revealed at a public beach, there's all these kinds of differences that's considered normal. So some things may be normal in one context, but certainly not in another. And basic moral principles, what is actually morally right or wrong, and values, what's really morally good or bad, are solely determined by what's normal in a culture. There's an argument by Ruth Benedict, a very prominent anthropologist, who argued exactly in this way, and other people have argued in this way, sociologists, anthropologists often, and in the past, philosophers, not so much recently. So from 1 and 2, they conclude that whatever's morally right or wrong, or good or bad, varies and is relative to a culture, the positive claim of conventionalism. Now, from there, they may go on to say, well, if 3 is true, then there are no objective moral principles or values. We have the negative claim. And so we can conclude that there are no objective moral principles or values. That follows from 3 and the if-then statement in 4. And we put 3 and 5 together, and we have conventionalism, right? We have the positive claim in 3, we have the negative claim in 5, and we have conventionalism. So that's a traditional argument for conventionalism. Now, a challenge is, why think that second premise is true? So here's the second premise again: the basic moral principles and values are solely determined by what's normal in a culture. Well, why think that that is true? Right now, early traditional arguments gave no defense of that whatsoever, and proponents of those traditional arguments, well, they seem to just assume something. They just seem to assume that this is true, or maybe it follows by definition of some sort, but they just declare the definition and then say it follows from that. But when they do so, their definition is highly controversial, so it's not really a good support. Now, another possibility is that maybe scientism is assumed to support this claim in number 2, something to that effect. But if you watch the video I have on scientism, you see that there are extremely good reasons to think that scientism is false. So this is not going to provide a good support for that premise either. So we don't have any reason to believe one of the major premises, so the argument fails on that basis. There is another motive for conventionalism, a more contemporary argument, and it starts by thinking about physics. And so the idea is that motion and other physical aspects of our world are relative. So imagine you're on the ground, you're looking up in the sky, and you see a jet plane flying overhead. Now, according to your perspective, the plane is moving across the sky, and of course you know that, oh, it's going several hundred miles an hour. Right? But for two people on the plane sitting next to each other, one might be asleep. And the steward may come by and say, has that person been moving around? And you say, no, not at all. They've been asleep the whole time. So is the person moving or not? It depends on your moral frame, not moral framework, your physical framework, right? Moving relative to the ground, not moving relative to the plane. So something that's moving in relation to one thing may be completely stationary in relation to something else. Right? So that's, as we think about motion, that seems to be true. And then the motive goes on to say, well, like motion, whether something is morally good or bad depends on the moral framework under consideration. So whether something's moving or not depends on its physical framework. Whether something's morally good or not depends on the moral framework. And obviously there are different moral frameworks for different cultures. To expand on that a little bit more, the idea is that morality is like etiquette. There are many different moral frameworks, and none of which is more correct than others. So when we think of principles of etiquette, for example, personal space, there are some cultures where even if you don't know the person very well, you may get, within a foot or so of their face when you're conversing. That's just normal in that culture. In our culture, we want people at arm's length if they don't know us very well. How you eat food, so eating rice with chopsticks or a fork or with your fingers, it varies according to the culture you're in, and whether or not you are engaging in proper etiquette then differs according to the culture. So whether or not something fits into the etiquette, it just varies according to the framework of the culture that you're in, and morality is like that. That's the claim. So principles of morality are just like principles of etiquette in that respect. Different cultures have different beliefs about what is morally right or wrong, and so whether something is morally right or wrong is completely dependent on what culture you are in. And the main basis for this idea, the principle here, is that moral relativism is the most plausible explanation of this diversity. When you recognize the diversity that exists among moral claims, then moral relativism is the best way to make sense of it. It's the most plausible explanation. So this is an argument to the best explanation. It also includes the analogy, and those kinds of arguments are perfectly fine arguments in terms of their structure. So morality is just like motion. It varies according to your framework. But what follows from that? If that's correct, what are some implications? Just a hint of part 2 here. Well, if it's true that slavery is morally permissible, accepted in some culture, then that's the end of the story, according to conventionalism. So do we want to say that? Do we really want to say that those people who were engaging in slavery in the United States in the 19th century and prior, that they were doing something morally good because in their culture at the time it was morally accepted? Do we really want to say that? Or do we want to go ahead and make the step and criticize that culture? Right, so that's going to be in part 2. What can be said for objectivism, the contrary view that there are moral principles that do apply to all people at all times? Are there motives for that? So that's going to be included in part 2.